Welcome to 10 Minute Record Reviews, episode 206, and today I'm going to review the 1984 quasi-compilation, I'll get to that in a second, by the Smiths, Hatful of Hollow. I have here a Portuguese issue, the first Portuguese pressing from 1984. Now, I'm not normally big on reviewing compilation records. It's not really the gig or the whole shtick of this channel, but I make an exception in this case. It's not really a compilation, it's a quasi-compilation. I say that because none of these songs, as they are recorded and as they appear in this record, had ever been released on a standard album. If we're going to talk about the Smiths, we may as well begin with Morrissey, who was born in 1959 on the outskirts of Manchester, but he grew up basically in central Manchester. As a teenager, he was an unpopular loner, and he immersed himself in both pop music and literature, so it's kind of surprising he didn't become a school shooter, but instead he became a punk. His early passions included the work of Oscar Wilde and also glam rock, Bowie, but also particularly the New York Dolls. In 1977, he joins a punk band in Manchester with Billy Duffy, who would go on to be the guitarist for the Cult, called the Nosebleeds. After the Nosebleeds broke up or were staunched, Morrissey and Duffy went on to join another punk band called Slaughter and the Dogs. The Dogs didn't enjoy that much success either, and in the late 70s and early 80s, Morrissey was basically a minor figure in the Manchester punk scene, but he also had his own literary pretensions. He worked for a music publication called The Record Mirror, but he also did his own writings, including short pieces on the New York Dolls and on James Dean. The two founding forces of the Smiths are, of course, Morrissey and Johnny Marr, the guitarist. Now, they had met in 1978 when Morrissey was 19 and Marr was only 14 at a Patti Smith concert in Manchester. That meeting didn't lead to great things right away, but Marr was already starting to move in the right circles musically. A year prior, he and his family had moved in 1977 to a neighborhood in Manchester which was rife with musicians, including Billy Duffy, the same guy that Morrissey would go on to be in punk bands with. Johnny used to listen to Duffy's band practice in the neighborhood. He taught himself how to play guitar, and he and a school friend, Andy Rourke, who'd picked up the bass, then formed their own band. Over the next few years, Marr and Rourke put together a series of bands, the best known of which on the local scene were the White Dice and a funk band called Freak Party. None of these bands lifted off, however, despite Marr's growing proficiency in guitar, primarily because of the lack of a decent singer. Of course, Marr had already met somebody who could sing, so in 1982 he decides to reacquaint himself with Morrissey. With a friend of his who was a bass player called Stephen Pomfret, he goes over to Morrissey's house, knocks on the door. Morrissey invites them in. They hit it off. Turns out they're into all sorts of the same literature, the same music, and Morrissey, of course, has written a whole bunch of poems. Marr is a big fan of the New York Dolls. He can't believe that Morrissey's actually written a piece on the New York Dolls, so they're really bonding, and they start to write tunes almost immediately. Within a week or two, they'd come up with The Hand That Rocks Their Cradle, which is based on a Morrissey poem, which is quite gothic, and also Suffer Little Children, which is based on the notorious serial killing which had happened near Manchester in the 1960s. In addition to those two originals, Morrissey also wanted them to cover A Boy for My Birthday, which was a song by the 60s girl group The Cookies. For his part, Marr was quite taken by the idea of having a song with a gay subtext, and gay themes, or even maybe more commonly, sexually ambiguous themes, run all the way through their catalog. They soon picked the name The Smiths, which was Morrissey's idea because he wanted to convey their ordinariness. Morrissey then drops his first name Stephen permanently and just goes by his last name, which is, of course, what ordinary people do. In these early months, they don't gig very much. They're very, very focused on recording demos. There's also some lineup changes. Pomfret leaves, Dale Hibbert comes in on bass. They make a demo for Factory Records in August 1982, or turn them down. They then audition for a permanent drummer. They hadn't really had one. People had been sitting in on session during these demos. Mike Joyce comes in. The classic lineup is complete when they decide after a couple of months that Hibbert isn't really up to it on bass. He's kicked out. Andy Rourke, who of course was Marr's previous collaborator, comes in on bass. They make another demo, this time for EMI, who also turned them down. They go down to London in early 1983 and they meet a guy called Jeff Travis with Rough Trade Records. He said he wouldn't sign them, but he would release one of their songs, Hand in Glove, as a single. They cut that single, and while they're still in London, they get a gig playing the University of London Student Union. And amongst the crowd at that concert is a producer for BBC's Radio 1, which is basically the pop channel on BBC Radio. It had been from 1967 on. The producer lined them up for an appearance on the John Peel Show, which was basically the show on the station at the time. In addition to the exposure, which was massive, they also made a real impact critically because they didn't sound like a lot of people. In fact, a lot of critics really struggled with where to pigeonhole them. They rapidly got interviewed by the New Musical Express, further increasing their exposure, and Rough Trade reconsiders its decision not to sign them to a record deal and signs them up. To record their debut album, Rough Trade put them into the studio with a guy called Troy Tate as a producer. Neither the record company nor the Smiths were particularly happy with the product, so the whole thing was scrapped and re-recorded, this time with a guy called John Porter. In all this process, which takes most of 1983, they released a number of singles as well. The one which fared best was What Difference Does It Make, with that really distinctive riff, very, very catchy tune. It makes it up to number 12. The debut album was finally released in February 1984, about a year after they'd first signed with Rough Trade Records. In that period, in addition to 3 singles and their B-sides, they'd also been back to Radio 1 3 different times and had quite a trove of well-recorded and well-performed songs. So the label and the band decided to release this trove of material, plus the singles and their B-sides, in one collection, which becomes Hatful of Hollow. So again, this record is largely populated with songs recorded in 4 separate sessions at Radio 1 over 1983, 2 for David Jensen and 2 for John Peel. Peel, of course, was one of the original Radio 1 DJs from day one in 1967. As a DJ, he became known as a tastemaker and as a risk-taker, but his risk-taking actually dates from far before his time as a DJ. In the early 1960s, as a young man in his early 20s, he had worked in the United States, including as an insurance salesman in Dallas. And he was in Dallas in November 1963 when President Kennedy was shot by Lee Harvey Oswald. When the assassination occurs, sensing an opportunity, he phones up the sheriff's office and says, falsely, that he's a photographer for the Liverpool Echo, the biggest newspaper in Liverpool. He shows up. He's actually there at the press conference when the Dallas police roll out Lee Harvey Oswald when he's been arraigned for the cameras. And amazingly, a piece of film endures from that press conference, which shows not only Peel, but also Jack Ruby attending the press conference. Ruby, of course, was stalking Oswald and would kill him a day later. In later decades, Peel became well known as a DJ in the UK for championing all kinds of new music and new musical styles, punk, reggae, electronic music, and it is probably fair to say, or at least arguable, that the sound of Western pop music in the 1970s and 1980s owes as much to John Peel as to any other non-musician. The record opens with William It Was Really Nothing, which is a song apparently about Billy Mackenzie, the lead singer of the Associates, who was a friend of Morrissey's, perhaps more than a friend, ambiguous as ever. Anyway, Mackenzie, I guess, didn't take too kindly to this and wrote his own response as a bit of a diss track subsequently. What Difference Does It Make follows, and this has, both in the riff and in that fantastic falsetto outro by Morrissey, 2 of the greatest moments, I think, in 80s rock history. The third track, These Things Take Time, is another example of the incredibly autobiographical, for sure, but very intimate lyrical portraits drawn by Morrissey. This charming man is about flirtations between Morrissey and someone else, presumably a man in his life again. Deliberately ambiguous, deliberately obscure. Was it the times, or was it just an attempt to be obscure? And now we come to the 4th track, and arguably the centerpiece not just of this record, but of their whole discography, which is How Soon Is Now. This song is basically about the loneliness of the long-distance clubgoer. The lyrics, their literary content and allusions, the production, the drums, just the whole vibe of the song is fantastic. But ultimately, it's all about that guitar sound and all about that riff. Amazingly, it did very poorly as a single, despite basically being their signature tune. And in the States, it did not chart at all. Some say due to poor marketing. I think it just could be a reflection on anti-intellectualism and the decline of empire. Handsome Devil is another killer riff with more sexually ambiguous lyrics. Hand in Glove, which of course was their first ever single, is a classic Morrissey lyric about a relationship between 2 beautiful people that has not much to recommend it except for the fact that they inspire envy in others. Side 1 closes with Still Ill, which is just okay. It's kind of a quintessentially Smith song, as if you had an AI computer basically program one. Side 2 starts with Heaven Knows I'm Miserable Now. This is Morrissey at his absolute best and one of Mara's most atmospheric accompaniments. This Night Has Opened My Eyes is one of a number of lyrics that Morrissey based on a play by Sheila Delaney, A Taste of Honey. The next 2 tracks are You've Got Everything Now and Accept Yourself. These are solid Smith tracks, basically B-sides, nothing particularly memorable. Girl Afraid is much better. This is about a relationship which lives and dies without ever being consummated in the heads of its protagonists because of their own anxiety and cynicism. Back to the Old House is beautifully atmospheric. This is just Mara and Morrissey together. The second last song is Reel Around the Fountain, which became quite controversial for a while thanks to the gutter press whipping up some kind of moral panic about it potentially being about child abuse, which it isn't. It's about a loss of innocence and about unrequited love. This performance drags and the song gets a bit turgid. Porter never felt the band nailed it in these sessions, and I think he's right. But never mind, because the very last track on the record is arguably the best, and that is Please, Please, Please Let Me Get What I Want. This is, and just trust me if you haven't heard this, one of the most perfect little pop songs ever written. This record has many brilliant songs and a few that are just okay. As a portrait of the early years as a band, it's arguably a better statement than their debut record. With 16 tracks, some of their best songs, and a running time of nearly an hour, this represents maybe the greatest bargain of the Thatcher years. It's value for money, and I give it 4.5 out of 5 stars.